First, and perhaps most important for many of you that are watching and listening, is to understand that the Chinese economy for quite some time now has had a mixture of privately owned enterprises and state-owned enterprises. You might think of it as a mixed economy between private and state. It is also true over the last 20, 25 years that the role of the private sector has been enlarged relative to the role of the state sector. However, that has to be made a little more complicated by noting that the Chinese, in managing this balance between the state and the private, give the dominance to the state. They say that the state-owned enterprises will always be the leading sectors, the main industrial groups within the Chinese economy. There's plenty of room for private enterprises, but the leading part of the economy will be the state. Why are the Chinese doing that? Excuse me. First and foremost, they are doing it because it's their way of learning from the experience of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union's kind of socialism, in which the state was overwhelmingly dominant and the private sector was really quite restricted, when the Soviet Union collapsed in on itself in 1989, it went through an extremely quick transition from an overwhelmingly state industrial sector to an overwhelmingly private one. This was pushed by the folks in Russia who wanted these changes. It was pushed by foreign advisors led by Jeffrey Sachs, now of Columbia University. It was called a kind of cold shower treatment or sometimes shock therapy as a way of fixing what was understood to be wrong. The Chinese analysis is that the suffering of the Russian people in the 30 years since then, the failures of the Russian economy in the 30 years since then, had largely to do with the excessive speed and the excessive extent of what happened in the Soviet Union, and they have been determined not to repeat that mistake. In other words, their Communist Party's plan is to make the transition slow and limited. Yes, foreign enterprises can come in if they're private capitalist enterprises, and many have. Yes, Chinese people can set up private enterprises, as many have. But the leading sectors of the economy will remain state-owned enterprises running the program of economic development that the state organizes under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party.